Tuesday at 1 o'clock. It's Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and welcome. And it's my special pleasure to welcome back to the show the remarkable poet and teacher, Geoffrey Nutter, by phone from Manhattan, to read new work and share his brilliance and exuberance about poetry and living in this world. Hi, Geoffrey.
Hi, Sharon. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. Thanks so much for being on the show again.
Of course. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. I want to read your bio for our listeners. Geoffrey Nutter is the author of Giant Moth Perishes, Wave Books 2021, A Summer Evening, winner of the 2001 Colorado Prize, Waters, Leaves, and Other Poems, winner of the 2004 Verse Press Prize, Christopher Sunset, winner of the 2011 Sheila Motton Book Award, The Rose of January, Wave Books 2013, and Cities at Dawn, Wave Books 2016. Geoffrey Nutter has recently traveled in China giving lectures, workshops, and readings as a participant in the Sun Yat-sen University Writers' Residency. His poems have been translated into Spanish, French, and Mandarin. Soir, a bilingual edition of his poems, translated into French by poets Freeman and Julien Marcland, was recently published in France. He has taught poetry at Princeton, Columbia, University of Iowa, NYU, the New School, and the 92nd Street Y. He currently teaches Greek and Latin classics at Queens College. And Geoffrey runs the Wallson Glass Poetry Seminars in New York City. Wow. Geoffrey. Oh, that's great. Geoffrey is my mentor and a guru of the Wallson Glass Seminars. So it's a particular wonderful pleasure for him to be on the radio. And Geoffrey, would you start us off with a poem?
Sure.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to read a poem from Giant Moth Perishes, which came out just some months ago. Mm-hmm. It's called The Opera Called Boys Against Girls. Yet all that summer it was boys against girls when the giant girls and boys were fighting, where past was prologue and all bore down on one another in the radiance of flooded land where the mezzo-soprano sang the dizzy aria. Did the gender binary ripen with you inside it curled like a lima bean surrounded by giants? This was the school where we learned the sweet science. We had opened the door into summer and passed back through into winter, where the taskmistress greets us. We were once common men. We were all common men, but now we are common no longer. I was a student there too, pupil and pugilist on Rush Street, mecca of clip joints, along strip malls and Sunrise and strip joints. This was the fanfare. This was the fanfare for the common man. For the common man grew unruly in the dark arena, cauliflowers growing in place of each ear, crumpled yams in place of the lips, the face a tuberose, the head a mandrake, until you were left asleep beneath a bamboo and octagonal windows, a dwarf in the cystic landscape. And the common woman grew into womanhood towering over the earth, where the great bell was tolling. It said you may see yourself as a wolf or a bear or some other kind of changeling flummoxed in a cold blur brought on by changes. And you are a Trojan addict tasked with living in the flesh's bulk whose demands are unforgiving. This was the year of our misgivings. Okay.
Wow, that's quite a flight.
Mm-hmm.
It starts in school, and then I hear this towering woman speaking to us, etc.
Yes.
It's a poem as experience. A poem really doesn't communicate linear experience, right? It is the experience, right, Geoffrey?
I would say so. I think that's a really great way to put it, that it doesn't, I mean, of course, it's its own kind of linear experience, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But just in the same way that dreams don't really, we don't experience them really as linear experiences. At least that's not the kind of logic that they present to us. I think that you're right. So,
last show, Geoffrey was on with us in September, and the show was so intriguing. Of course, Geoffrey is on again and will be on again next year. I hope. I'm just speaking for you, Geoffrey, without your permission.
For sure.
And you look at past poets in new ways, and how poets relate to the reader and to one another and to you and your experience of reading them. And you had mentioned something to me about your thoughts on Keats and Stevens.
Yeah. So there are these two poems that I do every class I teach. I teach the Anecdote of the Jar by Stevens, and I teach Ode to a Nightingale by Keats. And these are two poems that constantly surprise me. I'm always finding new things in these poems. I find these poems resistant to reading, but I feel like they're inviting, they're generous, but they're resistant, they're full of mystery, and they really bear a lifetime of reading and rereading. And on the other hand, I feel like these poems, I feel they really kind of go hand in hand. I know that some people teach Anecdote of the Jar kind of paired up with another, Keats's very famous poem about a vessel, which is Ode on a Grecian Urn. But I like to think of Ode to a Nightingale together with Anecdote of the Jar.
And could you tell us why? I think I just lost Geoffrey. And I will get him back. And I think I have Geoffrey. Are you there?
I'm here. I'm here.
Great. I'm sorry. Once in a while there's a glitch. And
that's okay.
Actually, you sound much clearer.
See, this is what happens even when you start talking about, Anecdote of the Jar and Ode to a Nightingale. Things start going off the rails.
I'm telling you, I think Stevens was making some comment.
They're just resistant. I tell you, they don't even want to really be talked about. So, yeah.
And one is such a long poem, and one is a very short poem.
Yes, yeah, definitely, for sure. And it's funny that that Anecdote of the Jar is 12 lines long, and it's quite as how can I say, amenable to talking about as Ode to a Nightingale in its great kind of comparative length. But I see, one of the things I see about Ode to a Nightingale, which is why I like to think about it in relation to the Stevens poem, is because it's such a great failure.
That's what I was so interesting. I was thinking of, you had mentioned that to me earlier, and how you're so audacious to say that, which I love. Tell me how.
Well, I think that Keats, I'm really with Keats. When I read that poem, I'm really pulling for him. And I feel like at the end of the poem, he just kind of, this word forlorn comes in and kind of wakes him up from this effort. One might call it like a daydream, but I think he's really going through an effort to get somewhere. He's really going through a great effort, which is the writing of the poem, to have this transformative experience. And at the end, he basically tells us, well, the imagination has failed. So it comes out and says it at the end, that this aspirational poem has failed. But of course, what we have is this poem, which is a document of that experience. And it's a very living document of this experience. So ultimately, it's a triumph, isn't it? Though his proposed and explicit, aim, as stated in the poem, in a way, it comes to nothing. It's ultimately a triumphant poetic experience.
Right. He sort of loses confidence in himself that what he's saying is really true, I guess.
Yeah,
and it goes back to reality. And what about the Stevens? How do you feel that way about his poem too?
That is just such a strange poem, isn't it? That's constantly. With that poem, it feels like not so much that Stevens is aspiring to something and kind of fails, but that the poem itself is sort of this oddly malfunctioning machine. And of course, the poem is perfect in the nature of its malfunctioning, it's this kind of this ingenious thing. But the poem is constantly feels on the verge of sort of falling apart. From the very beginning, it looks like a normal poem. It looks like a very approachable poem. It looks like the kind of poem I wanted to read when I was younger. And, I would look at a poem by Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman, and I just couldn't read them because they didn't look like the kind of well-ordered poem that I wanted to read. And Stevens has that look, the Anecdote of the Jar, and it quickly becomes apparent that something else is going on with it.
It's a very strange
and
poem.
It resists you at every turn, yes.
And it's very plain language. We probably should read it. We can't read the Ode to the Nightingale, which is very flamboyant language. But
right,
this is,
right.
I placed a jar in Tennessee, and he goes on, the wilderness rose up to it. But I place a jar in Tennessee, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything, really.
Right. What exactly does he mean? I mean, it sounds like he's throwing down a piece of garbage in the woods. Is he, right? What sort of jar is this? I mean, this is something else again, as we sort of see this jar for the first 10 lines or whatever, then suddenly we're told it's gray and bare. So we're not exactly sure what we've been looking at.
It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. And it comes from nowhere. Yeah. There is a majesty to it, but difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Very simple and very difficult at the same time.
Yes.
I don't know what those last lines mean. I don't know what, the lines, it took dominion everywhere, it was tall and of a port in air. I don't understand that syntax. I don't understand what that means. So I know the poem has been read in so many different ways, right? It's been, it can be sort of interpreted, kind of from a Marxist orientation or feminist or environmentalist. But of course, like the really fantastic thing about it is it both accommodates and kind of, resists all of these different readings.
Yeah, I love the way you juxtapose these two very different poems together, and you talk about wild imagination in both. I guess for Stevens, he worked in an insurance office, right? And maybe he saw something on the wall on his shelf, and it inspired him. Maybe he was writing up a Tennessee policy. Who knows?
Right.
It doesn't really matter. But Geoffrey, if you don't understand it, that gives all of us hope. Just to approach it without having to understand, not having to understand Wallace Stevens. That's a great gift. Thank you.
Understanding certainly isn't the most important thing, so I take solace in that. Yeah.
Right. And you also, in the last show, you mentioned as your influences the metaphysical poets, and since you had mentioned that, I've been looking at them, and they're hard to define also. I think it's it was a put down to call them metaphysical poets, sort of like when people called Philip Glass a minimalist, or, that was also a bad term. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's like Samuel Johnson threw that one out, right? I mean, Samuel Johnson in the 18th century, which was, the things that people were writing in England in the 18th century were so different and so well ordered. It was all, paired, rhyming couplets. And the metaphysical poems were so kind of wild in comparison. They were wild, they were strange, they were complex, they were dense, and they were often very hard to understand. So Samuel Johnson kind of put them down. They were too fancy. They were not easy for people then to read. Even at the time, people were like, "Oh, that John Donne." Who can get that stuff, right? So
it's very intense. It's sort of anti-enlightenment, I guess.
Oh yeah, for sure. But of course, it's like there's so much cleverness and humor in it, right? There are these. I was just teaching a couple of great John Donne poems today, and one is The Flea. It was basically, like so many of these poems, it's like a seduction poem, using this long, extended, conceit to try to convince someone to sleep with them. Okay. And you just know that this is not serious. This is all done in such a light and playful spirit, right? Like you can definitely imagine him laughing and chuckling to himself while he's like writing this or while this supposed speaker is saying this. But of course the poems are also, there's very, very serious metaphysical poems also. But it's really this whole group of poets that are called metaphysical poets are so very different, right? And one that you had mentioned was Thomas Traherne, who seems like, he's kind of lumped together with these guys too, but it's just so strange and almost like a romantic poet.
I agree, because the tone, it was so ecstatic or joyful, different when the poem speaks to the reader in a very different way. And can you read us a couple of lines from one of these poets to let us understand?
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to read like a little paragraph from Traherne, and it's not the most characteristic thing, but it's just so odd. And this is this series of prose poems that Traherne wrote called The Centuries.
He wrote prose poems? How weird! I didn't know that.
Long prose poem. I think it's like a series of 100. Well, I'll just read. This is number 2 from the first century, and it's short. It says, "Do not wonder that I promised to fill it with those truths you love." Fill it meaning the empty book. But no, not. For though it be a maxim in the schools that there is no love of a thing unknown, yet I have found that things unknown have a secret influence on the soul, and like the center of the earth unseen, violently attract it. We love we know not what, and therefore everything allures us. As iron at a distance is drawn by the lodestone, there being some invisible communications between them, so is there in us a world of love, to somewhat, though we know not what in the world that should be. There are invisible ways of conveyance by which some great thing doth touch our souls, and by which we tend to it. Do not you feel yourself drawn with the expectation and desire of some great thing?
Oh, my goodness.
Right?
It's like so modern in its way.
It really is.
It's
and
like,
it feels so
amazing.
full of, it's so open to mystery.
I thought the prose poem was invented by Baudelaire, I think. But this was, when was this written? In 16-something?
Early 1600s, I think it was. Pretty early. I mean, 1630s maybe, I think. I'm not exactly sure. It was around then.
And I was fascinated when I was researching that very slightly that the metaphysical poets were also known as the Baroque poets, which fits into the musical years of Baroque music from 1600 to 1750, the death of Bach. But as an old professor of mine used to say, well, the Baroque period really didn't end until the Handel died in 1759. He was a Handel nut, and so. But the whole thing of the Baroque, the excess, and the passion, really.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the sort of the best example of that. If we wanted to call anyone like truly Baroque, it would be this guy Crashaw, right? Who worked up such weird, elaborate conceits. Very, he's got long poem called "The Weeper," about about the breasts of the Virgin Mary. It's very, very strange stuff, and very kind of tortured. Again, very tortured, elaborate metaphors. So yeah, very, very odd stuff. Well, and again, like so different from stuff that would come later, right? It's interesting how tastes really change.
Well, I never thought I would like the metaphysical poets, but I was so drawn to them by the emotions in them. Everything's so dry now. There's a dryness in a lot of poetry.
Right.
But well, we've sort of flown along here, I want to talk about more of your influences, but I also want to talk about, somehow this is related in your interest in typewriters. And sort of bringing the past into the present. Could you why are you interested? You're not alone. I mean, Pamela will be on talking about this. In the typewriter. Yeah.
So I started using a typewriter many, many years ago. When I was a graduate student, the woman I was living with bought, one of the early computers. It was like a Mac Classic 2. Remember that little thing? It was about as big as a matchbox, but and just black screen. I tried to write on this thing, and I really couldn't. It seemed too easy to edit. I didn't have kind of physical evidence of what I had written. So I just went right back to using a typewriter, which is what I had started using.
Well, you've continued to write on a typewriter, is that right? You don't use a computer when you... Wow.
I do when it comes down to editing, when it's time to put a book together. Right. I do, but generally when I'm composing, I use a typewriter.
You do, and you keep all your drafts. All the drafts are in order.
I do. Yeah, I do. I love them. So, and they're beautiful, and they're I think that there's kind of a renewed interest in lots of young people in sort of physical, what do they call it, slow technology, right?
Sure.
My daughter, was interested in buying vinyl records, and the cassette tape is coming back. And again, lots of people are getting interested in typewriters. If you talk to my friend Jay Schweitzer down at Gramercy Typewriters in Chelsea, is just his work does not end. He's so busy fixing typewriters and refurbishing typewriters. The guy just doesn't stop working.
And you work on an electric or a manual?
I've been working on manuals all these years. Yeah, and I don't use these antique things. I'm very practical. I use 1970s models that are just very simple machines that are in very good working order, as if they just came out of the factory. But I'm about to buy an electric, though. Going down to Jay Schweitzer's shop tomorrow and probably picking one up.
Get more speed on it. But it's so interesting if you could scan your typewritten poems into the book, because you have that fluctuation in color and intensity and of course you can't duplicate that the paper and the feel of the letter.
Definitely. Well, I love looking at facsimile, of typewritten manuscripts, right? You look at the old, the facsimile of The Wasteland, or I have Allen Ginsberg's Howl, the facsimile of his typescript with his comments written on it. Beautiful stuff, right? We writers love that stuff.
Well, I would love. I'm very fortunate is that you do correspond with some of your students by typewritten message, which you mail by snail mail.
I want us all to bring it back. A good friend of mine, Mary Ruffel, who's a fantastic poet, she corresponds through snail mail, and I think that's the only way that you can correspond with her.
No phone?
What's that? No. There's no email for sure. So there's something beautiful and uncompromising about that, and I really want to help kind of bring, not that I need to bring it back, but I want to help move it along. I want to,
I have to ask you this: does she use whiteout in her correspondence? Little erasure poem action going on?
Not in her letters, but she'll send little pieces of little old pages of old books that are whited out. She'll send those things. Yeah, they're quite beautiful. It's nice to get lovely physical objects, and I think that's one of the attractions.
Yes. You're listening to Planet Poet, Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio, local in the Catskill Mountains, and on WIOXradio.org. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, here with the uniquely intriguing poet and teacher, Geoffrey Nutter. And now joining us by phone from Manhattan, To bring us the latest poetry news and the latest poetic insights is Planet Poet's Poet-At-Large poet and visual artist Pamela Manché Pearce. Pushcart Prize-nominated poet Pamela is exploring her ancestral roots in the McNamee clan, Ireland's hereditary poets starting in the 13th century. And hello, Pamela.
Hello, Sharon. Hello, Geoffrey. I am tempted to just give up my time and keep listening to you because it's such a wonderful show.
Thank you. Well, to be expected with Mr. Nutter on the air.
It's wonderful. And Trehane has just become my new poetry squeeze. I'm going to have to get off and go read it. I really got into what you read, Geoffrey. That was just fabulous.
Wasn't it incredible?
Good.
Who would know?
Oh, I'm so glad.
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
No, it's very exciting to make those discoveries. It really is. So thank you both, and thanks for having me on the show. I know that I'm supposed to talk about typewriters today, which warms my heart and delights me because I use a typewriter, and I have always used a typewriter. I have used one so much that it actually had to be thrown out. I spent time in Greece, summer after summer, doing some very good writing there while carrying around a TypeStar battery-operated typewriter, and that was quite something. And I may see you at Gramercy Typewriters tomorrow, Geoffrey, because they are trying to come up with some electric portables that I might like. So I'm waiting for them to call me to say, come down. I feel like I'm having a baby with a surrogate mother because I don't know what's going to happen, but I've placed my order, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I can't lift a Selectric. It's too heavy, or I would. My first choice would be a Selectric. But that's too heavy for me. So
they're monsters.
They're monsters, but they're such wonderful monsters, and it's that touch and the sound of them that, to me, it's very soothing. And I think, particularly for me, working on with an electric typewriter, it creates a place for me. The sound of it, it means that I am writing, and it reminds me of painters that I have spoken with over the years who say that when they open the studio door and they can smell the linseed oil, they know that that's what's going to. They cross the threshold, and they are opening some part of themselves to do their painting. And I think for me, when I flick that switch on the electric typewriter, no matter what else is happening around me, that is the moment when I enter that writing space. So it's very important to me. It's very pleasurable. And I like that. I like it a lot. So
beautiful.
And as I was preparing for this show, one of the things that I thought about was a number of years ago when I was on staff at Penn American Center and I was director of events and publicity. We would often throw a cocktail party at the home of a member writer, and everybody loved it because they got to go to the home of usually a famous writer and hang out and enjoy their space. And I went down to the home of a Tony Award-winning playwright and multi-Obie Award winner. I will not tell you who it is. And look at his apartment. And he worked in the dining room. It was a big apartment, and it had a very big dining room, a big dining room table with a typewriter on it. And I was there just a couple of minutes, and I realized that the entire on the entire periphery of the room, it was all typewriters. And
wow.
I said, I can't avoid asking you about that. And he said, well, you don't have to avoid asking him about it. And what had happened, and I could just feel this as he told me this, and I could just see it in his face. He said he was a very young playwright, and he was on a roll. And it was that gush of words that he couldn't stop, and he finally was getting it. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and the typewriter ribbon broke. And he couldn't, of course, get a new typewriter ribbon. And he couldn't get it down on paper with a pen the way that he wanted to because he was so dependent on working on a typewriter. And like Scarlett O'Hara, he swore that this would never happen to him again. So he began collecting typewriters, and he ribbed the entire room with it. So it could never happen.
It sounds like an art. Sounds like an art installation. Also, when you walk in.
It does sound like an art installation. But I think what really struck me is the intensity of his need to rely on this particular instrument to work with him as a writer. And I selected a couple of poems for today. I think I'm going to wind up only reading one of them, which is by Charles Bukowski, and it's called IBM Selectric. I don't know. Have you read this, Geoffrey?
I don't know it, no.
Okay. So Bukowski was, 1920 and died in 1994. He is an underground poet, and really his view was really, the depravity of urban life and the downtrodden in America, and he certainly lived that life. So here is IBM Selectric. Humming. It will do almost anything you ask it to do. Humming. Beneath its smooth gray paint, the machine knows. Even death stands back and asks, what the hell is this? Humming. It astonishes the walls, the windows, the cats, the ashtray, the wooden Buddha, and me. This machine can save my life. This machine has saved my life. This machine can create a woman more beautiful than any you have ever seen, or it can punch a bully in the nose. Humming. This machine is love found again in a flood of fire. This machine is a dance floor, a wild circus, a refuge for the nearly insane. This machine sprouts tiny flowers of courage in the middle of the night. This machine throws off sparks of light when the dark is as dark can get. When I recognize the futility of my efforts, when I feel age like the blade of death at 2 a.m., this amazing machine stands between me and that as it creates magical poems on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper.
Oh, beautifully read, Pamela.
Thank you.
That was lovely.
So it's
Very
so
nice.
passionate, and it really, to me, it really, I just feel him. I feel him with his machine, and I really love that poem. So
I love when he
Pamela.
said. Go ahead, Geoffrey.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Pamela, do you remember, was it Woody Guthrie who had written on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists"?
I do. I
think it's him.
You're absolutely right. I think.
Right?
And here we go. And you also, I found this on. There is an organization called Typewriter Rodeo in very active in Texas, and they printed that. You would love this, Geoffrey. They printed the original poem, which Bukowski typed on. Looks like receipt paper from a cash register. So it's because it is a very, very long, thin poem, and he signed it in 1940, and it's all crumpled up and everything else. So there is just. To end, there are two wonderful resources online. There's Typewriter Radio. They even have Typewriter Rodeo. Sorry, they even have a radio show. And then there's another site called The Classic Typewriter, and it published a book called The Typewriter Revolution, and it has 10 single-spaced pages of famous people, mostly writers, and the typewriter that they used during their lifetime.
Now that's obsessive. I love that.
Beautiful.
So perfect. It's obsessive. Obsessive much, right? It's just wonderful. So
I love Typewriter Radio. That's really good.
Well, okay.
Maybe start a new show.
We'll just do another show, right? We all have time. We'll create another show. So.
Well, I'm certainly going to do some looking around online when we end here, for sure.
All right.
So.
Thank you, Pamela Manché Pearce, Poet-At-Large.
Thanks for having me around.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Seminar, Geoffrey, and I may see you at Gramercy Typewriter.
Great. Oh, I hope so, Pamela. Thank you.
All right. Take care, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Geoffrey, would you read another poem?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hold on a second. I'll again read something from Giant Moth Perishes. Let's see. Okay. So this is called Anthropomorphic Landscape. One day, in order to have a more perfect union, they will rebuild the United States on the surface of the moon. Its buildings, its farms, its lakes, and its canyons, its offices, the dendriform columns of the Johnson Wax Administration Building and the Cigarette Growers League, all its great destinations, natural and man-made, the entire populace will be scattered among the lunar craters, the landforms, the water features, and close beside the ancient sea called the Sea That Has Become Known, or the Lake of Summer, or the mountain range called Albert Pink, or further and more glorious, the great red spot on Jupiter, its methane storms crackling above the Great Plains. Tractors and combines work amid pink grains of salt the size of houses. Or it could be on Everest, for instance, the highest place on Earth where surely it can do no harm. Or even the deepest under the sea in the Mariana Trench, or divided among rose-colored rooms of the mushroom houses, or the mirrored caverns of a fernery. It could be there. Might the States of the Union rather be wrapped across the face of a grass-covered ball? If on an artichoke plum purple will it tumble in the sea? Or a grass-covered head? If on the head with the boulder-strewn forest and the mountain is a man-like landform? It is a place where statues are used as habitation, and the people live in the head of one gigantic statue, or colossus, and the rural landscape, the hills, the windmills, the yellowing pastures, come together to form the features of a man. And the man's cat is a calico cat. Its whiskers as long as pine needles. Indeed, they are pine needles. The cat called Evergreen is curled up beside the rowboats. It wakes up and stretches, digging its claws into larkspur. It is handled gently by a girl who puts her book down, open with its pages lying flat on the table, daydreams as the distant, eccentric perturbers, as the astronomers have taken to calling the planets shine above her. The marjoram leans down to touch her, or the ferns nod down toward her and quickly spring away. Not far away, warm loaves of bread are taken straight from the ovens and placed in baskets, brought to the valley, and set beside bottles of golden wine. That's it.
That's much wilder than being on the moon, actually, that poem. You take us to the moon and absolutely somewhere else, which is the great point of it. And to have a girl reading a book on the moon or wherever it is, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And
thank you.
You have gotten me to appreciate wild flights of imagination, and it helped me do a little of that in my own writing. And but I don't know if you want to talk about Swinburne, or would you like to read a poem by David Friedman? What your choice?
Yeah, I'll read a poem by David Friedman. Okay. That would be really nice.
Great. And speaking of flights of imagination, if you could tell us a little bit about him, please.
Right. So David Friedman, very close friend of mine. We would write together for many years. We were friends for 25 years, and he died almost exactly a year ago, last February, of COVID. So he was 82, but he had stayed in his apartment for a whole year, but he managed, he had home health aides coming in. So I'm not exactly sure, how it happened, but anyway, we lost him. So this is, should I read this?
Sure.
Okay, one moment here. Let me find something.
An excerpt or anything.
Sure.
Because he's so, go ahead.
This is called Candid. To be candid, the glaze is metaphor, the eagle is satrap, and the classic conundrum is banter. Barter me the bloke and the silk hat drab as a trove of violet. To wield the dragonfly drapery, to succumb. Bridge me the classic breed of the opium of men, and let them tag along metamorphosed as camels. Cheer up, this could be a centipede. This could be a mile-high bridge built with serendipity. Go for the cure, the steam prod of the poke, and rest easy, transformer, be stern. So, like all of his poems, it's a prose poem, and yeah, it was very important for him that his poems be enjoyed and understood. So many of his poems are about this character called the Green Bear, but sometimes they were just kind of flights of
beautiful kind of wordplay like that one.
Oh, it's beautiful. It reminds me, we were going to talk about, if we'd have time, Swinburne and how his flights of fancy became unbearable to the modernists. The 20th century sort of, I guess, neo-Enlightenment movement. But he reminds me of Swinburne also. Not the language is not quite the same, but the flights are the opium men. And I just want to read for a minute a poem by Swinburne called "A Cameo." There was a graven image of desire, painted with red blood on a ground of gold, passing between the young men and the old, and by him pain whose body shone like fire, and pleasure with gaunt hands that grasped their hire. On his left wrist with fingers clenched with cold, the insatiable satiety kept hold, etc., etc. Like you said, it really doesn't mean too much, but it's beautiful. Right. It's beautiful language.
Yeah. And this is T.S. Eliot said something very funny about Swinburne, and Eliot had a whole essay about Swinburne where he says something to the effect of being able to say nothing in such a lengthy, sustained way is its own kind of genius. And I guess you can sort of say the same about someone like Ashbery, maybe, who sadly we couldn't have, didn't hear Eliot, of course, write about Ashbery, which would have been really interesting. But yes, Swinburne, you could just read page after page and then sort of not realize you almost had this experience of not reading anything. It was a very odd reading experience, but quite beautiful and sort of transitory. Yeah.
I just want to, we have so much to talk about. Hopefully you'll come on again. When you teach, what do you how do you introduce students who know nothing about poetry into poetry or writing poetry? What do you advise them to do when they start?
Usually I start every class I teach by giving some random words and then writing. And I think most kids that I teach have never done that before, and they're kind of, astounded by the fact that they come up with something beautiful and interesting. It surprises them because it would have been hard to just tell them to write something the first day of class. And then I usually teach, and I usually discuss Anecdote of the Jar, and I think it might make them feel a little encouraged to see me talking about a poem that completely confounds me.
That's okay.
Yeah. And, just to talk about all these different, things that a poem can do, all these, firing on all cylinders in so many ways. So, yeah. One of the things I think is very important to learn is to, write with a kind of objectivity also, which is why I also teach haiku. I think that, that's a very important sort of training, I guess, in sort of learning the importance of images and, sort of presenting images in kind of a dispassionate but very, very immediate and apprehensible way, which is its own kind of emotional and moving experience, isn't it?
Yes. Right. So. Well, I feel very lucky to be in Wallson Glass Seminars. And
I'm lucky to have you, Sharon.
Thank you. And I'm so excited for the young people who are studying with you, because they're very fortunate to have you as their first mentor in poetry. That's all I have to say, Geoffrey.
That's very kind of you to say.
Any updates? You're quite welcome. You want to give some links for your books, or people want more information on your classes and your books?
Well, people can just, I guess, go to wallsonglass.com, and I have information about these seminars, which again aren't workshops, but just places where poets get together and write. So, wallsonglass.com, and just look and see information on what it's all about there.
Okay, and for your books, more information on your books, you can go to Wave Books or Amazon.
Yep.
both there, and information about my books on the Wallson Glass website also.
Thank you. And that's
so, yeah.
WALLSON Glass.
Yep,
and
that's exactly right.
Geoffrey, this has been wonderful. Thank you for your patience. We, the technology gods, have been testing us, testing our durability and our resilience. And our This has been great. Thank you, and thanks for all your insights. And come back, please.
Thank you so much. I definitely will.
Thank you, and thank you, Geoffrey and Geoffrey Nutter, and thank you, Pamela Manché Pearce, Poet-At-Large, and thank you so much for listening.